Hello. Tonight I'd like to read chapter 23 from Robert Fisk's The Great War for Civilization, as I feel that this would be a good follow-on chapter from The Whirlwind War, my previous reading. Tonight we have the text on screen. Atomic Dog, Annihilator, Arsonist, Anthrax, and Agamemnon. You ask me about the sack of Baghdad. It was so horrible there are no words to describe it. I wish I had died earlier and had not seen how the fools destroyed these treasures of knowledge and learning. I thought I understood the world, but this Holocaust is so strange and pointless that I am struck dumb. The revolutions of time and its decisions have defeated all reason and knowledge. A pulsating minute-long roar of sound brought President George W. Bush's crusade against terrorism to Baghdad. There was a thrashing of tracer on the horizon from the Baghdad air defences, and then a series of tremendous vibrations that had the ground shaking under us, the walls moving, the sound waves clapping against our ears. Tubes of fire tore into the sky around the Iraqi capital, dark red at the base, golden at the top. Looking out across the Tigris from the riverbank, I could see the pinpricks of fire reaching high into the sky as America's bombs and missiles exploded onto Iraqi military and communications centres, and, no doubt, upon the innocent as well. Valhalla, I said to myself. This needed Wagner, the twilight of the gods, Götterdämmerung. No one in Iraq doubted that the dead would include civilians. Tony Blair had just said that in the House of Commons debate that very same week. But I wondered, listening to this storm of fire across Baghdad, if he had any conception of what it looks like, what it feels like, or the fear of those innocent Iraqis who were, as I wrote in my report an hour later, cowering in their homes and basements just before the missiles arrived. Just before the missiles arrived, I talked to an old Shia Muslim woman in a poor area of Baghdad, dressed in traditional black, with the white veil over her head. I pressed her for what she felt. In the end, she just said, "I am afraid." The explosions now gave expression to her words. That this was the start of something that would change the face of the Middle East was in little doubt. Whether it would be successful in the long term was quite another matter. It was a strange sensation to be on the ground in the start of this imperial adventure. The sheer violence of it, the howl of air raid sirens and the air-cutting fall of the missiles, carried its own political message, not just to Saddam, but to the rest of the world. We are the superpower, those explosions announced. This is how we do business. This is how we take our revenge for the 11th of September 2001. Not even President Bush had made any pretense in the last days of the peace to link Iraq with those international crimes against humanity in New York, Washington, and Pennsylvania. Yet the Americans were, without the permission of the United Nations, with most of the world against them, acting out their rage with a fiery consummation. Iraq, of course, could not withstand this for long. Saddam might claim, as he did, that his soldiers could defeat technology with courage. Nonsense. What fell upon Iraq on the 19th of March, and I witnessed in Baghdad just an infinitesimally small part of the festival of violence, was as militarily overwhelming as it was politically terrifying. The crowds outside my hotel stood and stared into the sky at the flashing anti-aircraft bursts, awed by their power. Did the British, I wondered, as I later stood on my hotel balcony near the Tigris, know where this would lead? Did we British not walk down this same arrogant path against the petty tyrants of Mesopotamia almost 100 years ago? And look what happened to the British Empire. Now, listening to those great explosions around Baghdad, I wondered what time had in store for the American Empire. Baghdad had always been a harsh place for me. Over the years I had made many friends in the city. Businessmen and their families, artists, retainers from the old regime, and yes, Baathists and their families, and at least one minister, Naji al-Hadithi, first the information minister and then the foreign minister, a man whose first response to pointed questions would be to look up at the ceiling. Up there, he would be telling us, up there in the ceiling was the microphone. But in the homes of Iraqis, I felt safe. Old photographs would show grandfathers in British Army uniform, young women shopping at Harrods in the 1950s, and much later, the same women, middle-aged, enjoying the oil wealth of Saddam's Iraq, walking in Knightsbridge in the late 1970s and 80s. But the insufferable heat of Baghdad in summer, and the constant minders whom the information ministry would attach to reporters on the most innocent of stories, would have a claustrophobic effect. After a while, the minders took our money and worked for us rather than the regime. We could buy them, and during this last Saddamite war, they would move imperceptibly from being servants of the regime to servants of the television networks. In the weeks following the liberation of Baghdad, they would become our employees. A few months later, we would find them working as employees of the United States occupying power. When we could shake off the minders, persuade them we were only taking a taxi to the grocery store when in fact we were heading to the slums of Saddam City, we could hear the men of the Shiite opposition, the rage of the Dawa party, the courageous voices of families who lived amid filth, who rose up at our bidding in 1991 and were betrayed, but who still waited for their moment of freedom. The senior ministry men knew we were making these illicit visits, but for $100 or for $200 they would disregard them. The regime was as corrupting as it was corrupt. Standing on the world's greatest wealth, it had given its people war, and yet more war. I had been in Baghdad as the Iranian Scud missiles had crashed into the nighttime city, on the front lines in the assault on Khorram Shahar in 1980. I had seen the Iraqi dead inside Iran in 1982 and inside Kuwait in 1991, and now I would see Iraqi dead again. Inside my brain was a memories box in which I would see as many Iraqis dead as alive, their bodies as vivid as the living. And it dawned on me, over a long period, that Iraqis must have seen themselves this way. They were both dead and alive. War had become not just part of their lives, but the very fabric of their existence. To fight and die for Saddam, for Iraq, for Arab nationalism, for patriotism, out of fear, was a natural phenomenon. Between 1980 and 1988, they fought the Iranians to prevent the occupation of their country. Occupation for Iraqis, for Arabs, for anyone of any race or religion was not just humiliation. It was a form of rape. The enemy came into your country, your city, your street, your home, your bedroom. They would tie you up, insult your family, torture you, kill you. Saddam's own secret policemen did that. They too were occupiers. Woe betide anyone who tried to take their place. The night before the first raids, I had walked around the Jadriya suburb of Baghdad, mixed Sunni Shia middle class, watching soldiers with their children on their shoulders, hugging their wives goodbye, kit bags over their shoulders, rifle in hand. Snapshot: Paris and Berlin and London 1914, Berlin 1939, Warsaw 1939, London 1939, the Soviet Union 1941, the United States 1941, and before Korea and during Vietnam, and among all the armies of the world as they set off on their wars to defend or promote civilization or fascism or communism. Second Lieutenant Bill Fisk, perhaps, in Birkenhead, 1918. And now I called at a pharmacy to buy bandages and plaster and lavatory paper. The chemist was a thoughtful man, explaining to the other glowering customers that the foreign journalists was just going to share their dangers, that they should treat him with kindness. I told the man that he was especially generous, since I thought my own Air Force, the RAF, would soon be bombing Baghdad. Yes, he said with a sad smile, I rather think they will. So at the start of this new and one-sided war, we reporters would be recording two different conflicts, the suffering of Iraqis and the death throes of the regime. The latter wanted us to view the two as identical. The Americans and the British insisted that they were destroying the regime in order to end the suffering. In fact, the suffering and the dying struggle of Iraqi Baathism could no more be separated than you could tear the bandages off a wound without causing the patient to shriek in pain. It was easy to argue that Saddam's wickedness was the cause of all their woes, but wounded and dying Iraqis did not see their fate in quite those terms. They were being attacked by Americans, not by Iraqis. American missiles and bombs were destroying their homes. They had fought and died on the Iranian front, only to be attacked and occupied by another foreign power. The Pentagon clearly understood this equation. Why else would the American military refuse to do what any professional army or occupying power would do? To count the number of civilian deaths during and after the war. Donald Rumsfeld was to assert that the American attack on Baghdad was as targeted an air campaign as was ever existed. But he could not have told that to the 5-year-old Doha Suhail. She looks at me on the first morning of the war, drip feed attached to her nose, a deep frown over her small face as she tries vainly to move the left side of her body. The cruise missile that exploded close to her home in the Rawanieh suburb of Baghdad blasted shrapnel into her legs. They were bound up with gauze, and far more seriously into her spine. Now she has lost all movement in her left leg. Her mother bends over the bed and straightens her right leg, which the little girl thrashes around outside the blanket. Somehow, Doa's mother thinks that if her child's 2 legs lie straight beside each other, her daughter will recover from her paralysis. She was the first of the patients brought to the Mustanriya hospital after America's blitz on the city began. There is something sick, obscene about these hospital visits. We bomb, they suffer. Then we reporters turn up and take pictures of their wounded children. The Iraqi Minister of Health decides to hold an insufferable press conference outside the wards to emphasize the bestial nature of the American attack. The Americans say they don't intend to hurt children, and Doa Suhail looks at me and the doctors for reassurance, as if she will awake from this nightmare and move her left leg and feel no more pain. So let's forget for a moment the cheap propaganda of the regime and the cocky moralizing of Messrs. Rumsfeld and Bush, and take a trip this bright morning in March 2003 around the Mustansariya College Hospital. For the reality of war, and here I unashamedly make my point again, is ultimately not about military defeat or victory, or the lies about coalition forces, which our embedded journalists were already telling about an invasion involving only the Americans, the British and a handful of Australians. War, even when it has international legitimacy, which this war does not, is primarily about suffering and death. Take 50-year-old Amel Hassan, a peasant woman with tattoos on her arms and legs, but who now lies on her hospital bed with massive purple bruises on her shoulders. They are now twice their original size. She was on her way to visit her daughter when the first American missiles struck Baghdad. I was just getting out of the taxi when there was a big explosion and I fell down and found my blood everywhere, she told me. It was on my arms, my legs, my chest. Amel Hassan still has multiple shrapnel wounds in her chest. Her 5-year-old daughter, Washed, lies in the next bed, whimpering with pain. She had climbed out of the taxi first and was almost at her aunt's front door when the explosion cut her down. Her feet are still bleeding, although the blood has clotted around her toes and is stanched by the bandages on her ankles and lower legs. The two boys are in the next room. Saad Salim is 11, his brother Omar 14. Both have shrapnel wounds to their legs and chest. Isra Riyad is in the third room with almost identical injuries. In her case, shrapnel wounds to the legs, sustained when she ran in terror from her house into her garden as the blitz began. Imam Ali is 23 and has multiple shrapnel wounds in her abdomen and lower bowel. Najla Hussein Abbas still tries to cover her head with a black scarf, but she cannot hide the purple wounds to her legs. Multiple shrapnel wounds. After a while, multiple shrapnel wounds sounds like a natural disease, which I suppose among people who have suffered more than 20 years of war, it is. So was all this, I asked myself, for the 11th of September 2001. All this was to strike back at our attackers, albeit that Doa Sawil, Wahid Hassan and Imam Ali had nothing, absolutely nothing, to do with those crimes against humanity, any more than had the awful Saddam. Who decided, I wonder, that these children, these young women should suffer for September 11th? Wars repeat themselves. Always when we come to visit those we have bombed, we have the same question. In Libya in 1986, American reporters would repeatedly cross-question the wounded. Had they perhaps been hit by shrapnel from their own anti-aircraft fire? Again in 1991, we asked the Iraqi wounded the same question. And now a doctor found himself asked by a British radio reporter, yes, you've guessed it, do you think, doctor, that some of those people could have been hit by Iraqi anti-aircraft fire? Should we laugh or cry at this? Must we always blame them for their own wounds? Certainly, we should ask why those cruise missiles exploded where they did. At least 320 in Baghdad alone, courtesy of the USS Kitty Hawk. Isra Riyadh came from Sadaria, where there is a big military barracks. Najla Abbas's home was in Rishala, where there were villas belonging to Saddam's family. The two Salim brothers lived in Skirta Kamse, where there was a storehouse for military vehicles. But that's the whole problem. Targets are scattered across the city. The poor and all the wounded I saw were poor, live in cheap, sometimes wooden houses that collapse under blast damage. It's the same old story. If we make war, we are going to kill and maim the innocent. Dr. Habib al-Hizai, whose FRCS was gained at Edinburgh University, counted 101 patients of the total 207 wounded in the raids in his hospital alone, of whom 85 were civilians, 20 of them women and 6 of them children, and 16 soldiers. A young man and a child of 12 died under surgery. No one will say how many soldiers were killed during the attacks. Driving across Baghdad was an eerie experience. The targets were indeed carefully selected, even though their destruction inevitably struck the innocent. There was a presidential palace with 4 10-meter-high statues of the Arab warrior Saladin on each corner. The face of each, of course, was Saddam's, and neatly in between, a great black hole gouged into the facade of the building. The Ministry of Air Weapons Production was pulverized, a massive heap of pre-stressed concrete and rubble. But outside at the gate, there were 2 sandbag emplacements, with smartly dressed Iraqi soldiers, rifles over the parapet, ready to defend their ministry from the enemy which had already destroyed it. The morning traffic built up on the roads beside the Tigris. No driver looked too hard at the Republican Palace on the other side of the river, or the Ministry of Armaments Procurement beside it. They burned for 12 hours after the missile strikes. It was as if burning palaces and blazing ministries and piles of smoking rubble were a normal part of daily Baghdad life. But then again, no one under Saddam's regime would spend too long looking at such things, would they? Iraqis were puzzled as to what all this meant. In 1991, the Americans struck the refineries, the electricity grid, the water pipes, communications. But on day 2 of this war, Baghdad could still function. The landline telephones worked, the internet operated, the electrical power was at full capacity. The bridges over the Tigris remained unbombed. My guess was that when, if was still a sensitive phrase, the Americans arrived in Baghdad, they would need a working communication system, electricity, transport. What had been spared was not a gift to the Iraqi people, I concluded. It was for the benefit of Iraq's supposed new masters. How wrong I was. The Iraq Daily emerged with an edition of just 4 pages, A clutch of articles on the steadfastness of the nation. Steadfastness in Arabic is sumud, the same name as the missiles Iraq partially destroyed before Bush forced the UN inspectors to leave by going to war. And a headline that read, "President, victory will come in Iraqi hands." During the bombing on Friday night, Iraqi television, again there had been no attempt by the US to destroy the television facilities, showed an Iraqi general appearing live to reassure the nation of victory. As he spoke, the blast waves from the cruise missile explosions blew in the curtains behind him and shook the television camera. So where did all this lead us? In the early hours next day, I looked once more across the Tigris at the funeral pyre of the Republican Palace and at the colonnaded ministry beside it. There were beacons of fire across Baghdad, and the sky was lowering with smoke. The buttressed, rampart-like palace, sheets of flame soaring from its walls, looked like a medieval castle ablaze. Ctesiphon destroyed, Mesopotamia at the moment of its destruction, as it had been so many times over so many thousands of years. Xenophon struck south of here, Alexander to the north. The Mongols sacked Baghdad. The Caliphs came, and then the Ottomans, and then the British. All departed. Now come the Americans. It was not about legitimacy. It was about something much more seductive, something Saddam himself understood all too well, a special kind of power, the same power that every conqueror of Iraq wished to demonstrate as he smashed his way across this ancient civilization. That second afternoon, the Iraqis lit massive fires of oil around Baghdad in the hope of misleading the guidance system of the cruise missiles. Smoke against computers. The air raid sirens began to howl again just after 6:20 p.m. on the 22nd of March, when Saddam's biggest military office block, a great rampart of a building 20 stories high beside his palace, simply exploded in front of me. A cauldron of fire, 100-foot sheet of flame, and a sound that had my ears singing for an hour afterwards. The entire buttressed edifice shuddered under the impact. Then 4 more cruise missiles came in. It was the heaviest bombing Baghdad had suffered in more than 30 years of war. To my right, a long colonnaded building looked much like the facade of the Pentagon, coughed fire as 5 missiles crashed into the concrete. In an operation officially intended to create shock and awe, Rumsfeld's latest slogan, shock was hardly the word for it. The few Iraqis in the streets around me, no friends of Saddam, I would suspect, cursed under their breath. From high-rise buildings, shops and homes came the thunder of crashing glass as the shock waves swept across the Tigris in both directions. Minute after minute the missiles came in. Many Iraqis had watched, as I had, the television tape of those ominous B-52 bombers taking off from Britain only 6 hours earlier. Like me, they had noted the time, added 3 hours for Iraqi time ahead of London, and guessed that at around 9 p.m. the terror would begin. The B-52s, almost certainly firing from outside Iraqi airspace, were dead on time. Policemen drove at speed through the streets, their loudspeakers ordering pedestrians to take shelter or hide under cover of tall buildings. Much good did it do. Crouching next to a block of shops, I narrowly missed the shower of glass that came cascading down from the upper windows as the shock waves slammed into them. A few Iraqis, husbands and wives, older children, could be seen staring from balconies, shards of broken glass around them. Each time one of the great golden bubbles of fire burst across the city, they ducked inside before the blast wave reached them. As I stood beneath the trees in the corniche, a wave of cruise missiles passed low overhead, the shriek of their passage almost as devastating as the explosions that were to follow. How, I asked myself, does one describe this outside the language of a military report? The definition of the colour, the decibels of the explosion, the flight of the missiles sounded as if someone was ripping to pieces huge canopies of silk across the sky. There is something anarchic about all human beings, about their reaction to violence. The Iraqis around me stood and watched, as I did, the tongues of flame bursting from the upper stories of the building beside Saddam's palace, reaching high into the sky. Strangely, the electricity grid continued to operate around us. The traffic lights continued to move between red and green. Billboards moved in the breeze and the shock waves. Floodlights continued to blaze on public buildings. Above us, curtains of smoke were moving over Baghdad, white from the explosions, black from the burning targets. How could one resist this? How could the Iraqis ever believe, with their broken technology, their debilitating 12 years of sanctions, that they could defeat the computers of these missiles and of these aircraft? It was the same old story. Irresistible, unquestionable power. Well, yes, we said to ourselves. Could one attack a more appropriate regime? But that was not the point. For the message of this new raid was the same as that of the previous night's raid, and of all raids in the hours to come. The United States must be obeyed. The EU, UN, NATO, nothing must stand in its way. Many Iraqis were already asking me, how many days? Not because they wanted the Americans or the British in Baghdad, but because they wanted the violence to end, which, when you think of it, is exactly how these raids took place. Exactly why these raids took place. It is the morning of the 25th of March 2003. Let us now praise famous men. Saddam Hussein is doing just that. Today he proceeds to list the Iraqi army and navy officers who are leading the resistance against the Anglo-American army in Qasr, Basra and Nasiriyah. Major General Mustafa Mahmoud Umran, commanding officer of the 11th Division. Brigadier Bashir Ahmed Othman, commander of the Iraqi 45th Brigade. Brigadier Colonel Ali Khalil Ibrahim, commander of the 11th Battalion of the 45th Brigade. Colonel Mohammed Khalif al-Jabawi, commander of the 45th Brigade's 2nd Battalion. Lieutenant Colonel Fatih Rani Majid of the Iraqi Army's 3rd Corps. And so it goes on. Be patient, Saddam keeps saying. Be patient. 14 times in all he tells the army and the people of Iraq to be patient. We will win. We will be victorious against evil. Patient but confident in victory, fighting evil. Wasn't that how President Bush was encouraging his people a few hours earlier? At other times, Saddam sounds like his hero, Joseph Stalin. They have come to destroy our country, and we must stand and destroy them, and defend our people and our country. Cut their throats. They are coming to take our land, but when they try to enter our cities, they try to avoid a battle with our forces and to stay outside the range of our weapons. Was this modelled on the Great Patriotic War, the defence of Mother Russia under Uncle Joe? And if not, how to account for those hundreds of Iraqi soldiers still holding out under the American air and tank attacks? People, party, patriotism. The 3 Ps run like a theme through Saddam's speech, along with a bitter warning. As the Americans and the British forces make less headway on the ground, Saddam says, they will use their air power against Iraq ever more brutally. So what does it feel like to live these days in President Saddam's future Stalingrad? A few hours later, the cruise missiles and the planes came back. The great explosions blanketed Baghdad in the darkness. One of the tomahawks smashed into the grounds of the Mustansiriya University. 25 students wounded and 1 dead, so they claimed. There were other sounds in the early hours. A blaze of automatic gunfire on the Tigris Corniche. Attempts to capture 2 escaping US airmen. The authorities insisted, and then a full-scale gun battle not far from the city centre at 2:30 a.m. There were rumours. Armed men had come from Saddam City, the Shia slums on the edge of Baghdad, and had been intercepted by state security men. no independent confirmation. A story that the railway line north of Baghdad has been cut, denied. On Sunday, Iraqi Minister of Defense General Sultan Hashem gave a remarkable briefing on the war, naming the units involved in frontline fighting. The 3rd Battalion of the Iraqi Army's 27th Brigade was still holding out at Suk ash-Sukyu, south of Nasiriyah. The 3rd Battalion of the 3rd Iraqi Army was holding Basra. And I remembered how these generals gave identical briefings during the 1980-88 war against Iran. When we checked on their stories back then, they almost always turned out to be true. Did the same apply today? General Hashem insisted that his men were destroying US tanks and armour and helicopters. This was easy to dismiss until videotape of 2 burning US armoured personnel carriers popped up on the television screen. Vice President Taha Yassin Ramadan had been obliging enough to explain the Iraqi army's tactics. It was Iraqi policy to let the Anglo-American armies roam around in the desert as long as they wanted, and to attack them when they tried to enter the cities, which seemed to be pretty much what they were doing. From Baghdad, with its canopy of sinister black oil smoke and air raid sirens, the American plan appeared to be rather similar: to barnstorm up to the desert parallel to the Tigris and Euphrates River Valley and try to turn right at every available city on the way. If there's trouble at Qasr, try Basra. If Basra is blocked, have a go through Nasiriyah. If that's dangerous, try to turn right through Najaf. But the open road, the long highway to Baghdad, lined with adoring Iraqis throwing roses at GIs and Tommies, was proving to be an illusion. Yet we could not travel. No Western journalist, even with permission to take a street taxi, could leave Baghdad city limits. On the 27th of March, I went to see my old friends at the Al Jazeera channel, whose local offices stood on the west bank of the Tigris. They had a crew in Basra, which was under British ground and air attack. I begged them to show me the rough cuts of the videotape they had received from Basra. If I could not go there, I could at least look through the lens of their cameraman before the Iraqis, or after transmission, the Americans and the British got their hands on it. I'd like to skip a couple of pages here because they don't make very easy reading, but you can read it on screen. So I don't want to hide this information. So you can just read the last paragraph on this page and the note if that interests you, and then I'm going to move on. You can pause to read it in your own time if you'd like. So then the next page is this. I'll count down from 10. So 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And I'll restart reading from the second paragraph. On the 28th of March, we realized that the Americans, perhaps because they were not advancing as fast as they planned, did not want to keep Baghdad's communications intact. It was difficult to weep over a telephone exchange. True, the destruction of the local phone system in Baghdad was a miserable experience for tens of thousands of Iraqi families who wanted to keep in contact with their relatives during the long dark hours of bombing. But the shattered exchanges and umbilical wires, broken concrete of the Mimoon International Telecommunications Centre scarcely equalled the exploded bones and intestines and torn flesh of the civilian wounded in Iraq. Command and control centres is how the CENTCOM boys described the targets they zapped in the early hours of the 28th. It represents another of those little degradations that we, as in we the West, routinely undertake when things aren't going our way in a war. Back in our 1991 blitz in Baghdad, we started off on the presidential palaces and barracks, then moved on to communications, then electricity, and then water treatment plants. In Serbia in 1999 it was the same story. First went the Yugoslav army barracks and arms factories, then the road brigades, phone system, the electricity. Now the same old story has begun in Baghdad. The presidential palaces and barracks have been hit. Time to smash the phones once again. Obviously, we hoped it wouldn't come to this. The Anglo-American armies wanted to maintain the infrastructure of Baghdad for themselves, after they had liberated the city under a hail of roses from its rejoicing people, because they would need working phone lines on their arrival. But after a night of massive explosions across the city, communications had been sacrificed. The huge Rashid telecommunications centre, destroyed in the 1991 bombardment, was struck by a cruise missile that penetrated the basement of the building. The exchange at Karada, where Baghdadis pay their phone bills, was ripped open. Outside each of these blocks, as outside every government institution here, can be found a giant hoarding of Saddam, doing whatever is appropriate to the relevant ministry or department. In front of Baghdad Central Station, for example, a Saddam in a felt hat is acting as a signalman to speed an express on its way to Basra. Services to the city, by the way, are now officially suspended because of the British military siege. At the Mummun Exchange, Saddam is standing in front of the telecommunications mast. At the Rashid offices, he is taking an old-fashioned Bakelite black telephone. He's talking on an old Bakelite black old-fashioned telephone while taking notes on a pad with a large brown biro. No more, because we have decided to destroy the phones and all those command and control systems that we included, dual use, into the network. So now most Baghdadis have to drive across town to get news of each other. There is more traffic on the roads than at any time since the start of the war. Down too went Baghdad's internet system. Iraqi television, whose studios were bombed by the Americans on the 26th of March, can only be watched between a growing number of power cuts. So what's next? Electricity or water? Since power runs the water pumps, both. Each day brings news of events which, on their own, have no great import, but which together add a grim new dimension to the invasion and its aftermath. At the end of March, hundreds of tribesmen from across Iraq met at the Baghdad Hotel before meeting Saddam. The Iraqi tribes, ignored by the military planners and Washington pundits who think that Iraq is held together only by the Ba'ath Party and the army, are a powerful force, their unity cemented by marriage and a network of families who provide a force as cohesive as the Ba'ath Party itself. Tribesmen guard the grain silos and some of the electricity generating stations around Baghdad. Two of them were credited with disabling an Apache helicopter, captured a week earlier, and now tribal leaders arrived from all over Iraq, from Hallujah, from Ramadi and Nineveh, from Babylon and Basra and Nasiriyah, and all the cities of Mesopotamia. So much for Defense Ministry Geoffrey Hoon's contention that Saddam has lost control of southern Iraq. They will return today and tomorrow to their cities and villages with instructions on how to oppose the Americans and British armies. Saddam has already issued one set of orders that tells the tribesmen to fight the Americans and the British in groups and attack their advance and rear lines to block the way of their progress. If the enemy settles into a position, start to harass them at night. I am puzzled about this. Guerrilla forces may harass an occupying army, but will do little harm during an invasion when the overwhelming firepower and movement of the invaders can suppress any opposition. Only when the occupying soldiers settle into barracks and routine patrols do they become vulnerable. So is Saddam giving these tribesmen their marching orders for the war? or their instructions for the post-war occupation? Could it be that Saddam is confronting the possibility of military defeat in the field? Is there a future insurrection being planned here in Baghdad as the Americans storm up the road towards Nasiriyah? On the 10th floor of the Palestine Hotel, where I live amid the cell-like rooms of more than 100 other journalists, I have squirreled away a little library of books to read in the long, loud nights. William Shirer's The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich and J.F.C. Fuller's The Second World War, to remind me of what real war is like, and Tolstoy's War and Peace, to recall for me how conflict can be described with sensitivity and grace and horror. I can heartily recommend The Battle of Borodino to anyone, and some volumes of poetry, and a big disorderly pile of newspaper and magazine articles which I tore from my Beirut archives before leaving for Amman and Baghdad. Tonight I pull out a long rant by Pat Buchanan, written well over 5 months earlier, and almost without thinking. I pull my pen from my pocket and start scribbling harsh lines in the margin of this prophetic article. If Providence does not intrude, we will soon launch an imperial war in Iraq, with all the onto-Berlin bravado with which French poilus and British Tommies marched on August 1914. But this invasion will not be the cakewalk neoconservatives predict. To destroy Saddam's weapons, to democratize, defend, and hold Iraq together, US troops will be tied down for decades. Yet terrorist attacks in liberated Iraq seem as certain as in liberated Afghanistan. For a militant Islam that holds in thrall scores of millions of true believers will never accept George Bush dictating the destiny of the Islamic world. With our MacArthur Regency in Baghdad, Pax Americana will reach apogee, but then the tide recedes, for the one endeavour at which the Islamic peoples excel is expelling imperial powers by terror and guerrilla war. They drove the Brits out of Palestine and Aden, the French out of Algeria, the Russians out of Afghanistan, the Americans out of Somalia and Beirut, the Israelis out of Lebanon. We have started up the road to empire, and over the next hill we will meet those who went before. The only lesson we learn from history is that we do not learn from history. It was an outrage, an obscenity. The severed hand on the metal door, the swamp of blood and mud across the road, the human brains inside a garage, the incinerated skeletal remains of an Iraqi's mother and her 3 children in their still smouldering car. 2 missiles from an American jet killed them all. 21 Iraqi civilians torn to pieces on the 27th of March before they could be liberated by the nation that destroyed their lives. Who dares, I asked myself at the scene, to call this collateral damage? Abu Taleb Street was packed with pedestrians and motorists when the American pilot approached through the dense sandstorm that covered northern Baghdad in a cloak of red and yellow dust and rain that morning. It was a dirt-poor neighbourhood of mostly Shia Muslims, the same people whom Messrs. Bush and Blair still fondly hoped would rise up against President Saddam Hussein. A place of oil-sodden car repair shops, overcrowded apartments and cheap cafes. Everyone I spoke to heard the plane. One man, shocked by the headless corpses he had just seen, could say only 2 words: roar, flash. He kept saying, and then closed his eyes so tight that the muscles rippled between them. I'm faced by the same old question. How to record so terrible an event? Iraqis are now witnessing these awful things each day, so there is no reason why the truth, all the truth of what they see, should not be told. For another question occurred to me as I walked through this place of massacre. If this is what we are seeing in Baghdad, what is happening in Basra and Nasiriyah and Karbala? How many civilians are dying there too? Anonymously indeed, unrecorded, because there are no reporters to be witness to their suffering. Abu Hassan and Malik Hamoud were preparing lunch for customers at the Nasser restaurant on the north side of Abu Taleb Street. The missile that killed them landed next to the westbound carriageway, its blast tearing away the front of the cafe and cutting the two men, the first 48, the second only 18, to pieces. A fellow worker led me through the rubble. "This is all that is left of them now," he said, holding out before me an oven pan dripping with blood. At least 15 cars burst into flames, burning many of their occupants to death. Several men tore at their doors of another flame-shrouded car in the center of the street that had been flipped upside down by the same missile. They were forced to watch helplessly as the woman and her 3 children inside were cremated alive in front of them. The second missile hit on the eastbound carriageway, sending shards of metal into the 3 men standing outside a concrete apartment block with the words, "This is God's possession," written in marble on the outside wall. The building's manager, Hisham Danoun, ran to the doorway as soon as he heard the massive explosion. "I found Ta'ar in pieces over there," he told me. "His head was blown off. That's his hand." A group of young men and a woman took me into the street, and there, a scene from any horror film, was Ta'ar's hand, cut off at the wrist, his 4 fingers and thumb grasping a piece of iron roofing. His colleague, Sir Med, died at the same instant. His brains lay piled a few feet away, a pale red and grey mess behind a burnt car. Both men worked for Danoun. So did a doorman, who was also killed. As each survivor talked, the dead regained their identities. There was the electrical shop owner, killed behind his counter by the same missile that cut down Ta'ar and Sir Med and the doorman, and the young girl standing on the central reservation trying to cross the road, and the truck driver who was only feet from the point of the impact, and the beggar who regularly called to see Mr. Danoun for bread and who was just leaving when the missiles came screaming through the sandstorm to destroy him. In Qatar, the Anglo-American forces announced an inquiry. The Iraqi government, who are the only ones to benefit from the propaganda value of such a bloodbath, naturally denounced the slaughter, which they initially put at 14 dead. So what was the real target? Some Iraqis said there was a military encampment less than a mile from the street, though I couldn't find it. Others talked about a local fire brigade headquarters, but the fire brigade can hardly be described as a military target. Certainly there had been an attack less than an hour earlier on a military camp further north. I was driving past the base when 2 rockets exploded, and I saw Iraqi soldiers running for their lives out of the gates and along the side of the highway. Then I heard 2 more explosions. These were the missiles that hit Abu Taleb Street. Of course, the pilot who killed the innocent could not see his victims. Pilots fire through computer-aligned coordinates, and the sandstorm would have hidden the street from his vision. But when one of Malik Hamoud's friends asked me how the Americans could so blithely kill those they claimed they want to liberate, he didn't want to learn about the science of avionics or weapons delivery systems. And why should he? For this is happening almost every day in Baghdad. On the 24th of March, an entire family of 9 was wiped out in their home near the centre of the city. On the 25th of March, a busload of civilian passengers was reportedly killed on a road south of Baghdad. On the 26th, Iraqis were learning the identity of 5 civilian passengers slaughtered on a Syrian bus that was attacked by American aircraft close to the Iraqi border. We may put on the hair shirt of morality in explaining why these people should die. They died because of September 11th, we may say, because of the weapons of mass destruction, which do not exist, because of our desperate desire to liberate all these people. Let us not confuse the issue with oil. Either way, I wrote that night, I'll bet we are told that Saddam is ultimately responsible for all their deaths. We shan't mention the pilot, of course. And we didn't. Faulty Iraqi anti-aircraft missiles, the same old excuse, had probably killed them all, the Americans said. It was not possible. The two missiles had exploded equidistant from each other on both carriageways. No guidance systems could fail on two anti-aircraft missiles at exactly the same time, causing them to land so neatly on the same road. There is no end to this. Just a day later, on the 28th of March, the atrocity is repeated. The evidence this time is a piece of metal only a foot high, but the numbers on it hold the clue. At least 62 civilians have died by the afternoon of the 29th of March, and the coating on that hunk of metal contains the identity of the culprit. The Americans and British were doing their best to suggest, here we go again, that yet one more Iraqi anti-aircraft missile destroyed those dozens of lives, adding that they were still investigating the carnage. But the coding on the missile fragment is in groups of numerals and Latin letters, not in Arabic, and many of the survivors heard the plane. In the Al-Nur hospital, there were the appalling scenes of pain and suffering. A 2-year-old girl, Saida Jafar, swaddled in bandages and tubes, a tube into her nose, another into her stomach. All I could see of her was her forehead, 2 small eyes and a chin. Beside her, blood and flies covered a heap of old bandages and swabs. Not far away, lying on a dirty bed, was 3-year-old Mohammed Mahmid. His face, stomach, hands and feet all tied tightly in bandages. A great black mass of congealed blood lay at the bottom of his bed. This is a hospital without computers, with only the most primitive of X-ray machines. But the missile was guided by computers, and that vital shard of fuselage was computer coded. It can easily be verified and checked by the Americans, if they chose to do so. It reads 30003-704 ASB 7492. The letter B is scratched and could be a H. This is believed to be the serial number. It is followed by a further code which arms manufacturers usually refer to as the weapon's lot number. It reads MFR 9621409. The piece of metal bearing the coatings was retrieved minutes after the missile exploded on the evening of the 28th by an old man whose home is only 100 meters away from the 2-meter crater. Even the Iraqi authorities do not know that it exists. The missile sprayed hunks of metal through the crowds, mainly women and children, through the cheap brick walls of local homes, amputating limbs and heads. Three brothers, the eldest 21 and the youngest 12, were cut down inside a living room of their brick hut on the main road opposite the market. 2 doors away, 2 sisters were killed in an identical manner. We have never seen anything like these wounds before, Dr. Ahmed, an anaesthetist at the Al-Nur hospital, told me later. These people have been punctured by dozens of bits of metal. He was right. The old man I visited in a hospital ward had 24 holes in the back of his legs and buttocks, some as big as pound coins. An X-ray photograph handed to me by one of his doctors clearly showed at least 35 slivers of metal still embedded in his body. As with the Abu Talib Street massacre, Shu'ala is a poor Shia Muslim neighbourhood of single-storey corrugated iron and cement food stores and 2-room brick homes. Again, these are the very people whom Messrs. Bush and Blair expected to rise in insurrection against Saddam. But the anger in the slums was directed at the Americans and British, by old women, bereaved fathers and brothers who spoke without hesitation and without the presence of the ubiquitous government minders. "This is a crime," a woman muttered at me angrily. "Yes, I know they are saying they are targeting the military, but can you see soldiers here? Can you see missiles?" The answer has to be in the negative. A few journalists did report seeing a Scud missile on a transporter near the Sha'ab area on Thursday, and there were anti-aircraft guns around Shu'ala. I heard an American jet race over the scene of the massacre and just caught sight of a ground-to-air missile that was vainly chasing it, its contrail soaring over the slum houses in the dark blue sky. An anti-aircraft battery manufactured around 1942, also began firing into the air defense. Also began firing. Also began firing into the air a few blocks away. But even if the Iraqis do position or move their munitions close to the suburbs, does that justify the Americans firing into those packed civilian neighborhoods, into areas that they know contained crowded main roads and markets, and during the hours of daylight? The 27th of March attack on Abu Taleb Street was carried out on a main road at midday during a sandstorm, when dozens of civilians are bound to be killed, whatever the pilot thought he was aiming at. I had 5 sons, and now I have only 2, and how do I know that even they will survive? A bespectacled, middle-aged man asked in the bare concrete back room of his house. One of my boys was hit in the kidneys and heart. His chest was full of shrapnel. It came right through the windows. Now all I can say is that I am sad I am alive. A neighbour interrupted to say that he saw the plane with his own eyes. I saw the side of the aircraft, and I noticed it changed course after it fired the missile. Plane spotting has become an all-embracing part of life in Baghdad. I respond in my paper to a reader who thoughtfully asks if I can see with my own eyes the American aircraft over the city. I have to reply that in at least 65 raids by aircraft, I have not, despite my tiger-like eyes, actually seen one plane. I hear them, especially at night, but they are flying at supersonic speed. During the day they are usually above the clouds of black smoke that wash over the city. I have just once spotted a cruise missile. The cruise or Tomahawk rockets fly at only around 400 miles per hour, and I saw it passing down a boulevard towards the Tigris River. But the grey smoke that shoots out of the city like the fingers of a dead hand is unmistakable, along with the concussion of sound. And when they can be found, the computer codings on the bomb fragments reveal their own story, as the codes on the Shu'ala missile surely must. All morning the Americans were at it again, blasting away at targets on the perimeter of Baghdad, where the outer defences are being dug by Iraqi troops. And in the centre of the city, an air-fired rocket exploded on the roof of the Iraqi Ministry of Information, destroying a clutch of satellite dishes. One office building from which I was watching the bombardment swayed for several seconds during a long raid. Even in the Al-Nur hospital, the walls were shaking as the survivors of the market slaughter struggled for survival. Hussein Natai is 52 and just stared at me, his face pitted with metal fragments, as bombs blasted the city. A 20-year-old man was sitting up in the next bed, the blood-soaked stump of his left arm plastered over with bandages. Only 12 hours ago, he had a left arm, a left hand, fingers. Now he blankly recorded his memories. I was in the market and I didn't feel anything, he told me. The rocket came and I was to the right of it, and then an ambulance took me to hospital. Whether or not his amputation was dulled by painkillers, he wanted to talk. When I asked him his name, he sat upright in bed and shouted at me. My name is Saddam Hussein Jassim. At the end of March 2003, Sergeant Ali Jafar Musa Hamdi al-Nuani drove a car laden with explosives into a US Marine checkpoint in southern Iraq and blew himself up. He was the first Iraqi combatant known to stage a suicide attack. During the uprising against the British rule, not one Iraqi killed himself like this to destroy his enemies. Nomani was also a Shia Muslim, a member of the sect the Americans faithfully believed to be their secret ally in their invasion of Iraq. Even the Iraqi government initially wondered how to deal with this extraordinary action, caught between its desire to dissociate themselves from an event that might remind the world of Osama bin Laden and its determination to threaten the Americans with more such attacks. The details of the 50-year-old sergeant's life were few but intriguing. He was a soldier in the 1980-88 war, the Iran-Iraq War, and volunteered to fight in the 1991 Gulf War, the mother of all battles, according to Saddam Hussein. Then, though, he was over age for further fighting. Nomani volunteered to fight the Anglo-American invasion, and so it was, without telling his commander and in his own car, that he drove into a US Marine checkpoint outside Najaf. Saddam awarded him the Military Medal, First Class, and the Mother of All Battles Medal. The dead man left 5 children, a widow, and a new place on the 2,000-year history of Iraqi resistance to invasions. A US spokesman said that the attack looks and feels like terrorism, although since Nomani was attacking an occupation army and his target was a military one, no Arab would ever believe this. Within hours of al-Nomani's death, Taha Yassin Ramadan, the Iraqi vice president, was talking like a Palestinian or Hezbollah leader, emphasizing the inequality of arms between the Iraqis and the Americans. The US administration is going to turn the whole world into people prepared to die for their nations, he said. All they can do now is turn themselves into bombs. If the B-52 bombs can now kill 500 or more in our war, then I'm sure that some operations by our freedom fighters will be able to kill 5,000. It was clear what this meant. The Iraqi leadership was just as surprised at Nomani's attack as were his American victims. This made no sense to us. Iraqis were not suiciders. As the Americans might say, this did not compute. I wrote a half-hearted dispatch to the Independent on the 30th of March, trying to make sense of what had happened. Of course, I had forgotten the Iran-Iraq War, the conflict in which Nomani had participated, and the suicidal battles in which the Iraqis fought and died. Suicide bombers, I wrote, whether they be Shia Muslim, Lebanese, successfully evicting Israel's army of occupation, or the Palestinians destroying Israel's sense of security, are the ultimate weapon of the Arabs. The US first understood its power when suicide bombers struck the American embassy in Beirut in 1983 and the Marine barracks in Beirut on the 23rd of October the same year, when 240 American servicemen died. Only when Arabs bent on a far more devastating suicide mission launched their attacks on the 11th of September 2001 did Washington finally realize that there was no effective defense against such tactics. In a strange way, therefore, September 11th at last finds a symbolic connection with Iraq. While the attempts to link President Saddam's regime with Osama bin Laden's turned out to be fraudulent, the anger that the US has unleashed is real and has met the weapon the Americans fear most. Most suicide bombers are younger than Nomani and unmarried, but someone must have helped him to rig the explosives in his car, must have taught him how to set off the detonator. And if this was not the Iraqis, as they claim, then was there an organization involved of which both the Americans and the Iraqis know nothing? There was some talk by Vice President Ramadan of the martyr's moment of sublimity, an expression hitherto unheard of in the Ba'athist lexicon. General Hazim al-Rawi of the Ministry of Defense recalled that the dead man bore the same name as the Imam Ali and announced that the new martyr Ali has opened the door to jihad. He said that more than 4,000 volunteers from Arab countries were now in the country and that martyrdom operations will continue not only by Iraqis but by thousands of Arabs who came to Baghdad. In my report that night, I wrote that suddenly, it seems, Islam has intruded into this very nationalistic war of liberation, for that is what it is called here, against the Americans. In retrospect, Nomani's suicide was one of the most important moments in this war. It shocked the Americans, whose superficial reaction about terrorism hopelessly underplayed the meaning of the attack, and it surprised the Iraqis. But the language of the Baathists, the talk of martyrdom, operations, and the International Arab Legion that would supposedly continue them, should have set those old cliché alarm bells ringing loud. Something had started outside Najaf, a precedent most serious for any invading army. In a land without any such tradition a match had been lit. A vicious, dark storm has smashed into Baghdad, leaving my hotel room yellow with sand. The dust and muck of the city now lie like a shroud over the carpets and bed linen and tables. The cleaning staff have long ago fled. My files are covered in fine grains of sand, so that the pages slither out of their boxes with the sound of a knife leaving a sheath. I work my way with dirty fingers through the section that I have marked with the word Islam. Mostly the pages are about Shiite resistance, but I have some handwritten notes, never used in a report since I did not understand their meaning, to the effect that Saddam had, in 2000, allowed the creation of Islamic committees, groups of Sunni Muslim religious scholars and their followers who would be permitted to discuss Islamic law and Quranic teaching, provided they never mentioned politics, never combined their beliefs with the secular world of the Ba'ath. These committees now existed in Mosul and Bakuba, Fallujah and Ramadi, and in Baghdad. Another sand-ingrained page emerged from my file, a single flimsy page from a 5-year-old copy of The Economist. Iraqis saddened by misfortune are turning to comfort to their religion, the report says. So in his own manipulative way is their leader, Saddam. Saddam was building in Baghdad the largest mosque in the world, with room for 45,000 worshippers and minarets 600 feet in height. The Iraqi flag now had the words Allahu Akbar, God is great, inscribed in the white rectangle between the red and black of the national banner, the eagle of Iraq between Allahu and the Akbar. In 1997, Saddam had given Abdul Monim Abu Zant, a Jordanian calling for an Islamist state in his own country, a weekly half-hour program on Iraqi television. Mosque attendance is rising fast, particularly among the young, the Economist reporter writes. He quotes a Baghdad resident who says that before the Kuwait War, about 90 men would come to the mosque in my neighbourhood for Friday prayers. Now, more than 1,000 worshippers turn up, mostly young people. There is not enough space, so they pour into the streets. There had been increased observance during the Ramadan month of fasting. The Economist regarded Saddam's involvement in this reawakening of Islam as manipulative, but listening to the government's response to the suicide bombing, not to mention the news of Nomani's martyrdom, I began to wonder if Saddam was being compliant rather than manipulative, whether he had discovered a power that would have to be appeased rather than suppressed, one that embraced his own Sunni Muslim people as well as the Shia. Within a week, 2 women, an even more unheard of precedent, would blow themselves up at another American checkpoint. At dusk, the ground around the Baghdad Northgate Cemetery shook with the vibration of the bombs. The oil-grey sky was peppered with anti-aircraft fire, and below the clouds of smoke and the tiny star-like explosion of the shells, Sergeant Frederick William Price of the Royal Garrison Artillery, Corporal A.D. Adsitz of the York and Lancaster Regiment, and Aircraft Man First Class P. McGee of the Royal Air Force slept on. An eerie place to visit, perhaps, as the first of the night's raids closed in on the capital of Iraq. Sorry. Not so, for Iraqi Foreign Minister Najaf Sabri had spoken earlier of these graves of colonizers past. Sergeant Price and Corporal Adsets and Aircraft Man McGee all died in Britain's first colonial war in Iraq in 1921. And what was it that Mr. Sabri, dressed in his Ba'ath Party uniform, said? British soldiers already have their graveyards in Iraq, from the 1920s and from 1941. Now they will have other graveyards, where they will be joined by their friends, the Americans, which is why I took a street taxi that very same hour to the dusk to the Northgate Cemetery on the old Mosul Road from Baghdad to have a look at the men about whom Naji Sabri spoke. Private Nicholson of the York and Lancaster Regiment was only 23 when he died on the 12th of August 1921. Private Clark of the Royal Army Service Corps was 38 when he was killed 6 days later. This first guerrilla war against Western occupation is now to be refought, according to the Iraqi Ba'ath Party. But when? Against this huge invading force, or afterwards? We shall turn our desert into a big graveyard for the American and British soldiers, Sabri said, as the missiles crisscrossed Baghdad. One swept over the Tigris at only 200 feet above the ground to explode with a roar and a plume of grey smoke in a presidential compound. The temperature of the language rose proportionately. The new colonizers, according to the foreign minister, were using the old British golden rule of divide and conquer. Forget for a moment that divide et impera was originally a Roman rule, and he promised they would never break the unity of the Iraqi people. How much of this rhetoric could be abandoned if there was a way out of this war? Real diplomacy, the fantastical Shahaf announced, is to kill them, the Americans and the British, on the battlefield so that they feel their dreams have been foiled. We are not going to allow these dirty lackeys to remain on in the land of Iraq. Lackeys? Didn't it used to be the lackeys and running dogs when the Soviet Union existed? Are we really reverting to colonialism, since the Americans have not reneged on their pledge of occupation and military government? It's hard to avoid the question. Nor was it difficult to imagine what aircraft man First Class McGee might think as his grave vibrated to the explosion of bombs from the very same Royal Air Force as he long ago died for in Iraq. It is growing hotter in Baghdad, in every sense of the word, and in a month the temperature will rise to 35 degrees. The dense black shroud of oil smoke that covers the city is now creating a fog that makes even the mildest of air raids into a thing of mystery. At 4:45 p.m. next day comes the sound of jets again, followed by a series of short, sharp explosions that last for up to a minute. They sound all too familiar to my ears, the rumble of cluster bombs, legal against armour, but decidedly illegal if used against civilians. I peer for 10 minutes through the smoke from a high-rise apartment block, to no avail. Whether the bombs are dropped in the suburbs, on a military barracks, or in a built-up area is impossible to discover. Nor is the status of Baghdad in this war. Far from being besieged, its main roads north and south are still open. A few trains are still leaving for northern cities, and although US troops are reported to have set up a checkpoint on the road west to Amman, they appear to have been a flying column, stopping trucks and cars for a few hours and then vanishing into the desert at night. By evening, Vice President Ramadan turns up at the pseudo-Greek villa assigned to government spokesman beside the Ministry of Information. He has the intriguing habit of never looking at anyone who asks him a question, to insist that 6,000 Arab volunteers have arrived in Iraq to fight the Americans and British, half of them anxious for martyrdom. Ramadan repeats yet again that Iraq has no weapons of mass destruction, and spends some time, rather a lot of time in fact, claiming that the Americans and the British might plant such weapons in Iraq in order to fool the world and justify their invasion. And then comes a lecture which, I couldn't help suspecting, reflected all too faithfully the current anger of Saddam Hussein. The Saudi Foreign Minister, Prince Saud al-Faisal, was Ramadan's and thus Saddam's target. He has offered advice, which is something he is in the habit of doing, and his advice is that he would like to see our leader leave his post. Ramadan thunders. Let me tell this lackey, this stooge, this small entity, they know full well who his cousin is, the so-called Prince, Ambassador Bandar in Washington, and who he works for. Let them, the Saudis, say to him, go to hell. All we wish for is that you do not have an Arab name. Let me tell you, you are too small, too much of a nothing to say a word to the leader of Iraq. Those who give up will be swept away from the land of the Arabs, which didn't do a lot for Iraqi-Saudi relations. Then we in Baghdad hear that the Secretary of State Colin Powell is announcing to the American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee, the largest Israeli lobby group in the United States, who of course support the invasion, that Syria and Iran are supporting terror groups and will have to face the consequences. What, we all asked, was happening now? Are we going to forget Baghdad for a few months and wheel our young soldiers west to surround Damascus? George W. Bush now tells us the war may be long and difficult. He didn't tell us that before, did he? And according to Tony Blair, this is only the beginning. Strange how all the fuss about chemical and biological warfare had been forgotten. The secret weapons, the gas masks, the anti-anthrax injections, the pills and chemical suits and all the rest have now been erased from the story, because bullets and rocket-propelled grenades are now the real danger to British and American forces in Iraq. Even the siege of Baghdad, a city that is 30 miles wide and might need 250,000 men to surround it, is fading from the diary. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, according to the New Yorker, interfered with the general's plans. This was going to be, I quote Rumsfeld, a war of a kind we have never seen before. Sitting in a Baghdad cafe, listening to the god-awful propaganda rhetoric of the Iraqis, but watching the often promiscuous American and British air attacks, targeting an alleged missile battery near a marketplace in a capital city at midday during a sandstorm, is going to kill civilians. I have a suspicion that this war's foundations were based not on military planning, but on ideology. Long ago, as we knew, the right-wing pro-Israel lobbyists around Mr. Bush planned to overthrow Saddam. This would destroy the most powerful Arab state in the Middle East. Israel's Chief of Staff, Shoal Mofaz, demanded that the war should start even earlier than it did and allow the map of the region to be changed forever. Powell stated just this a month ago. Illusions were given credibility by a superpower and moral overdrive. Any kind of mendacity could be used to fuel this ideological project. September the 11th, oddly unmentioned now, links between Saddam and Osama bin Laden unproven, weapons of mass destruction unfound, human rights abuses at which we originally connived when Saddam was our friend, and then finally, the most heroic project of all, the liberation of the people of Iraq. Oil was not mentioned, although it is the all-important and dominating factor in this illegitimate conflict. No wonder General Tommy Franks, the American commander, admitted that his first concern prior to the war was the protection of the southern Iraqi oil fields. So it was to be liberation and democracy. How boldly we crossed the border. With what lordly aims we had invaded Iraq. Few Iraqis doubted, even the ministers in Baghdad spoke about this, that the Americans could ultimately occupy the country. They have the force, I wrote on the 2nd of April, and they have the weapons to smash their way into every city and impose a curfew and rule the land by martial law. But can they make Iraqis submit to that rule? Unless the masses rise up, as Mr. Bush and Mr. Blair hope, this is now a nationalist war against the most obvious kind of imperial power. Without Iraqi support, how can General Franks run a military dictatorship or find Iraqis willing to serve him or run the oil fields? The Americans can win the war, but if their project fails, they will have lost. I read these words today with some mystification. There they are, printed in the Independent, but I cannot remember writing them. Perhaps the suicide bombing had jogged my reporter's hand. Maybe that rhetoric about martyrdom. War produces infinite fatigue. All day we would travel and write and try to stay alive, and then at night curled up in our beds in the Palestine Hotel, in the belief, vain as it was to turn out, that this guaranteed our safety, we would lie awake as giant explosions tore across the city. War was also about insomnia. At last, the Iraqis decide to truck us out to Baghdad, to Masayib and to Hilla. The road to the front of the central Iraq is a place of fast-moving vehicles, blazing Iraqi anti-aircraft guns, tanks and trucks hidden in palm groves, a train of armoured vehicles bombed from the air and hundreds of artillery positions dug into revetments to defend the capital. Anyone who doubts that the Iraqi army is prepared to defend its capital, I wrote in my notebook, should take the highway south of Baghdad. How, I kept asking myself, could the Americans batter their way through these defences? Looking back, I wonder if that is why we were taken, to view the earthworks and ditches and gun embrasures that would in a few days be abandoned by their defenders. For mile after mile they go on, slit trenches, ditches, earthen underground bunkers, palm groves of heavy artillery, and truckloads of combat troops in battle fatigues and steel helmets. Not since the 1980-88 Iran-Iraq War have I seen the Iraqi army deployed like this. The Americans may say they are degrading the country's defences, but there was little sign of that here. That a Western journalists could see more of Iraq's military preparedness than many of the reporters embedded with the British and American forces said, as much for the Iraqi government's self-confidence as it did for the need of Saddam's regime to make propaganda against its enemies. True, there are signs of the Americans and the British striking at the Iraqi military. 2 gun pits have been turned to ashes by direct airstrikes, and a military barracks, empty like all the large installations that were likely to be on the Anglo-American target list, has been pulverised by missiles. A clutch of telephone exchanges in the towns around Hilla have been destroyed, along with the bombing of 6 communication centres in Baghdad. The country's phone system appears to have been shut down. On a rail track further south, a train carrying military transport has been bombed from the air, the detonations blasting 2 entire armoured vehicles off their flatbed trucks and hurling them in bits down an embankment. But other APCs, including an old American 113 vehicle, presumably a captured relic from the Iranian army, remained intact. If that was the extent of the Americans' success south of Baghdad, there are literally hundreds of military vehicles untouched for 150 kilometres south of the capital, carefully camouflaged to avoid air attack. Like the Serb army in Kosovo, the Iraqis have proved masters of concealment. An innocent wheat field, fringed by tall palm trees, turned out, on closer scrutiny, to be traversed with bunkers and hidden anti-aircraft guns. Vehicles were hidden under motorway bridges, which the Americans and British very definitely do not wish to destroy because they want to use them if they succeed in occupying Iraq, and fuel trucks dug in behind deep earth revetments. At a major traffic intersection, an anti-aircraft gun was mounted on a flatbed truck and manned by 2 soldiers scanning the pale blue early summer skies. As well they might. Contrails hung across the skies between Baghdad, Karbala and Hilla. Above the centre of Hilla, home to the ancient Sumerian Babylon, a distant American AWACS plane could be seen circling high in the heavens, a tiny white dot indicating the giant scanner above the aircraft, its path followed by the eyes of scores of militiamen and soldiers. Driving the long highway south by bus, I could see troops pointing skywards. If hanging concentrates a man's mind wonderfully, fear of an airstrike has almost the same effect. An Iraqi journalist beside me insisted that an American or British aircraft whose course we had been fearfully tracking from our vehicle was turning back towards the south, ignoring traffic on the main road. A few minutes later, it reappeared in front of us, flying in the opposite direction. Driving the highway south, a lot of illusions are blown from the mind. There are markets in the small towns en route to Babylon, stalls with heaps of oranges and apples and vegetables. The roads are crowded with buses, trucks and private cars, far outnumbering the military traffic. The truckloads of troops and just occasionally the sleek outline of a missile transporter with canvas covers wrapped tightly over the truck it is hauling. In the town of Iskandaria, cafes and restaurants were open. Shops were selling takeaway kofta, meatballs and potatoes, and the tall new television aerials that Iraqis now need to watch their state television channel, whose own transmitter had been so constantly attacked by American and British aircraft. This was not a population on the edge of starvation, nor indeed did it appear to be a frightened people. If the Americans were about to launch an assault through this farmland of canals and massive forests of palm trees and wheat fields, it looked at first glance like a country at peace. But the large factories and government institutions seemed deserted. Many of the industrial workers and employees standing outside main gates, only 30 kilometers south of Baghdad. There came the thump of bombs, and our bus shook with the impact of anti-aircraft rounds. A series of artillery pieces to our right were firing at an elevation over our heads, the gun muzzles blossoming gold. The shells exploded above the canopy of grey smoke from Baghdad's oil fires, which now spread 80 kilometers south from the city. The images sometimes stretched the limits of comprehension. Children jumping over a farm wall beside a concealed military radio shack. Herds of big humped camels moving like biblical animals past the Soviet-made T-82 battle tank hidden under palm branches. Fields of yellow flowers beside fuel bowsers, and soldiers standing amid bricks kilns. An incoming American missile explosion that scarcely prompts the farmers to turn their heads. On one pile of rubble north of Hilla, someone had fixed the red, white and black flag of Iraq, just as the Palestinians tie their banners to the wreckage of their buildings after Israeli attacks. Was there a lesson in all this? I had perhaps 2 hours to take it all in, to wonder how the Americans could batter their way up this long, hot highway. You can feel the temperature rise as you drive south, with its dug-in tanks and APCs and its endless waterlogged fields and palm plantations. The black uniformed men of the Saddam Fedayeen, with red and black kufiya scarves around their heads, whom I saw 150 kilometers south of Baghdad, were kitted out with ammunition pouches and rocket-propelled grenades, and they did not look to me like a degraded army on the verge of surrender. All this, I wrote that night, may be an illusion. The combat troops I saw may have no heart for battle. The tanks may be abandoned when the Americans come down the highway towards Baghdad. The fuel bowsers may be towed back to the capital, and the slit trenches deserted. Saddam may flee Baghdad when the first American and British shells come hissing into the suburbs, and the statues of the great leader that stand outside so many villages along the highway may be ritually sundered. This would prove to be very much the case, but it didn't feel that way in early April. It looked like an Iraqi army and a Ba'ath Party militia that were prepared to fight for their leadership, just as they had at Qasr, and in Basra, and in Nasiriyah, and Sut al-Shuk. Was it something else they might be fighting for? An Iraq, however dictatorial in its leadership, that simply rejected the idea of foreign conquerors, or Iraqis who cared more about Iraq than Saddam, and who identified the Americans as their enemies without obeying Saddam's orders. The wounds are vicious and deep, a rash of scarlet spots on the back and ties our face. The shards of shrapnel from the cluster bombs buried an inch or more in the flesh. The wards of the Hilla Teaching Hospital, some 50 kilometers south of Baghdad, are proof that something illegal, something quite outside the Geneva Conventions, occurred in the villages around the city once known as Babylon. The wailing children, the young women with breast and leg wounds, the 10 patients upon whom doctors had to perform brain surgery to remove metal from their heads, talk of the days and nights when the explosives fell like grapes from the sky, cluster bombs, the doctors say, and the detritus of the air raids from around the hamlets of Nadar and Jafil, and Amarkin and Mahwil and Mohdishan and Hail Askeri shows that they are right. Were they American or British aircraft that showered these villages with one of the most lethal weapons of modern warfare on the 29th, 30th and 31st of March? The 61 dead who have passed through the Hilla Hospital cannot tell us, nor can the survivors who in many cases were sitting in their homes when the white canisters opened high above their village, spilling thousands of bomblets that explode in the air or swoop through windows and doorways to burst indoors, or skip off the roofs of the concrete huts to blow up later in the roadways. Rahed Hakim remembers that it was 10:30 that Sunday morning, when she was sitting in her home in Nadar, that she heard the voice of explosions and looked out of the door to see the sky raining fire. She said the bomblets were a black-grey colour. Mohammed Musa described the clusters of little boxes that fell out of the sky in the same village and thought they were silver-coloured. They fell like small grapefruit, he said. If it hadn't exploded and you touched it, it went off immediately. They exploded in the air and on the ground, and we still have some in our home unexploded. Karima Misler thought the bomblets had some kind of wires attached to them, perhaps the metal butterfly which contains sets of the tiny cluster bombs and which springs open to release them in showers above the ground. Some died at once, mostly women and children, some of whose blackened, decomposing remains lay in the tiny charnel house mortuary at the back of the Hilla Hospital. The teaching college had received more than 200 wounded since the night of Saturday the 29th of March. The 61 dead are only those who were brought to the hospital, or who died during or after surgery, and many others are believed to have been buried in their home villages. And of these, doctors say about 80% were civilians. Soldiers there certainly were, at least 40 of these statistics if the statistics are to be believed, and amid the foul clothing of the dead outside the mortuary door, I found a khaki military belt and a combat jacket. But village men can also be soldiers, and both they and their wives and daughters insisted there were no military installations around their homes. True or false, who is to know, if a tank or a missile launcher was positioned in a nearby field, as they were along the highway north to Baghdad yesterday. But the Geneva Conventions demand protection for civilians, even if they are intermingled with military personnel, and the use of cluster bombs in these villages, even if aimed at military targets, thus transgresses international law. So it was that 27-year-old Yamin came to receive those awful round wounds in her back, and so Zaman Abbas, 5 years old, was hit in the legs, and 48-year-old Samir Abdul Hamza in the eyes, chest and legs. Her son Haidar, a 32-year-old soldier, said that the containers which fell to the ground were white with some red and green sometimes painted on them. It is like a grenade, and they came into the houses, he said. Some stayed on the land, others exploded. Heartbreaking is the only word to describe 10-year-old Maryam Nasser and her 5-year-old sister Hoda. Maryam has a patch over her right eye, where a piece of bomb lead embedded itself, and wounds to the stomach and thighs. I didn't realize that Hoda, standing by her sister's bed, was wounded until her sister carefully lifted the younger girl's scarf and long hair to show a deep puncture in the right side of her head, just above her ear. congealed blood sticking to her hair, but the wound still gently bleeding. Their mother described how she had been inside her home and heard an explosion and found her daughters in a pool of blood near the door. The girls alternately smiled and hid when I took their pictures. In other wards, the hideously wounded tried to laugh to show their bravery. It was a humbling experience. The Iraqi authorities, of course, were all too ready to allow us journalists access to these patients. But there was no way these children and their often uneducated parents could manufacture these stories of tragedy and pain. Nor could the Iraqis have faked the scene in Nader village, where the remains of the tiny bomblets littered the ground beside the scorched marks of the explosions, as well as the shreds of the tiny parachutes upon which the bomb clusters float to the ground once their containers have broken open. A crew from Sky Television even managed to bring a set of bomblet shrapnel back to Baghdad from Nader with them, the wicked metal balls that are intended to puncture the human body still locked into their frame like cough sweets in a metal sheath. They were of a black colour which glinted silver when held against the light. The deputy administrator of the Hilla Hospital and one of his doctors told a confused tale of military action around the city in recent days, of Apache helicopters that would disgorge special forces troops on the road to Karbala. One of their operations, if the hospital personnel are to be believed, went spectacularly wrong one night when militiamen forced them to retreat. Shortly afterwards, the cluster bomb raids began. Artillery rather than aircraft might have been used to deliver the bomblets, although the villages that were targeted appeared to have been on the other side of the Hilla to the abortive American attack. The most recent raid occurred on Tuesday, when 11 civilians were killed, 2 women and 3 children among them, in a village called Hindiya. A man sent to collect the corpses reported to the hospital that the only living thing he found in the area of the bodies was a hen. Not till 4 days later were Iraqi bomb disposal officers ordered into the villages to clear the unexploded ordnance. Needless to say, it was not the first time that cluster bombs had been used against civilians. During Israel's 1982 siege of West Beirut, its air force dropped cluster bomblets manufactured for the US Navy across several areas of the city, especially in the Fakani and Uzai districts, causing civilians ferocious and deep wounds identical to those I saw in Hilla. Vexed at the misuse of their weapons, such are designed only for use against exclusively military targets, the Reagan administration withheld a shipment of fighter bombers for Israel, then relented a few weeks later and sent the aircraft anyway. Nor is it easy to listen to Iraqi officials condemning the use of illegal weapons by the USAF and the RAF when the Iraqi Air Force itself dropped poison gas on the Iranian army and on pro-Iranian Kurdish villages during the 1980-88 war against Iran. Outraged claims from Iraqi officials at the abuse of human rights by Americans and British invaders sound like a bell with a very hollow ring. But something grievously happened around Hilla at the end of March, something unforgivable and contrary to international law. Conceit ruled Baghdad. Information's minister, Sahaf, promised that the Americans would perish like snakes in the desert. Even as those same Americans were massed on the outskirts of Baghdad, almost encircled by his enemies, Saddam now appeared on state television to urge Iraqis to fight to the death against the Anglo-American invasion force, because victory is in reach. He appeared in military uniform and black beret beside an Iraqi flag, with white cloth as background, accusing the Americans of fighting by stealth. He told Iraqis they could fight with whatever weapons they have. The enemy, he said, is trying in vain to undermine our heroic resistance by bypassing the defences of our armed forces around Baghdad. The enemy avoids fighting our forces when they find out that our troops are steadfast and strong. Instead, the enemy drops some troops here and there in small numbers. As we had expected, you can fight these soldiers with whatever weapons you have. The phrase, as we expected, suggests that the Iraqis had in fact been taken by surprise by the immobility of the American tactics, which had in effect erased the very notion of the front line upon which Iraqi troops were traditionally taught to fight. Remember that brave old farmer who shot an Apache helicopter with his rifle, Saddam remarked. The chopper had been brought down on the 24th of March, and conspiracy theorists immediately suggested that the president's television address might have been recorded more than a week ago in anticipation of a siege of Baghdad. They need not have bothered. In the last days of his rule, Saddam had become the repository of his own myth, a man who, even as Bush threatened him with war, had prepared to write romantic novels in his palaces. And now his soldiers and the civilians of Iraq were paying the price. I ventured out on the 5th of April, and in a fast car with a government driver who had already been bought by the Independent and was now loyal to Fisk rather than Saddam. It was just as well. We drove at speed towards the airport and then turned back towards the city as we heard the power diving jets. These were glimpses of fear and death, mere sketches to take back with me to fill out the front page of our Sunday on this last weekend of the invasion. Beside the highway, a squad of troops was stacking grenades as the ground beneath us vibrated with the impact of US airstrikes. The area was called Qadisiyah. It was Iraq's last front line. An Iraqi armoured vehicle was still smouldering, a cloud of blue-grey smoke rising above the plane trees under which its crew had been sheltering. 2 trucks were burnt out on the other side of the road. The American Apache helicopters had left just a few minutes before we arrived. A squad of soldiers, flat on their stomachs, were setting up an anti-armour weapon on the weed-strewn pavement, aiming at the empty airport motorway for the first American tanks to come thrashing down the highway. A truck crammed with more than 100 Iraqi troops, many in blue uniforms, all of them carrying rifles that gleamed in the morning sunlight, sped past me towards the airport. A few made victory signs in the direction of my car. My driver was touching 145 kilometers an hour on the speedometer. But of course, one had to ask what their hearts and minds were telling them. Up the line to death was the phrase that came to mind. 2 miles away, at the Yarmouk hospital, the surgeons stood in the car park in blood-stained overalls. They had already handled their first intake of military casualties. A few hours later, an Iraqi minister was to tell the world that the Republican Guard had just retaken the airport from the Americans, that they were under fire but had won a great victory. Around Qadisiyah, it didn't look like that way. Tank crews were gunning their T-72s down the highway, past the main Baghdad railway yards, in a convoy of armoured personnel carriers and jeeps, and Soviet and clouds of thick blue exhaust fumes. The more modern T-82s, the last of the Soviet-made fleet of battle tanks, sat hull down around Jordan Square with a clutch of armoured vehicles. Across vast fields of sand and dirt and palm groves, I saw batteries of SAM-6 anti-aircraft missiles and multiple Katyusha rocket launchers awaiting the American advance. The soldiers around them looked relaxed, some smoking cigarettes in the shade of the palm trees or sipping fruit juice brought to them by the residents of Qadisiyah, whose homes, heaven help them, were now in the firing line. But then a white-painted Japanese pickup truck pulled out in front of our car. At first I thought the soldiers on the back were sleeping, covered in blankets to keep them warm. Yet I had opened my car window to keep cool this early summer morning, and I realized that all the soldiers there must have been 15 of them in the little truck, were lying on top of each other, all with their heavy black military boots dangling over the tailboard. The 2 living soldiers on the vehicles sat with their feet wedged between the corpses. So did America's first victims of the day go to their eternal rest. Dawn on the 6th of April started with a series of massive vibrations, a great stomping sound that physically shook my room. Stomp, stomp, stomp it went. I lay in bed trying to fathom the cause. It was like the moment in Jurassic Park when the tourists first hear the footfalls of the tyrannosaur, an ever-increasing, ever more frightening thunder of regular, monstrous heartbeats. From my window on the east bank of the Tigris, I saw an Iraqi anti-aircraft gun firing from the roof of a white 4-story building half a mile away, shooting straight across the river at something on the opposite bank. Stomp, stomp, it went again, the sound so enormous that it set off the burglar alarms in 1,000 cars along the riverbank. And it was only when I stood on the roadway a few minutes later that I knew what had happened. Not since the last Gulf War in 1991 had I heard the sound of American artillery fire, and there, only a few hundred meters away, on the far bank of the Tigris, I saw them. At first they looked like tiny armoured centipedes, stopping and starting, dappled brown and grey, weird little creatures that had come to inspect an alien land and search for water. You had to keep your eye on the centipedes to interpret reality, to realize that each creature was a Bradley fighting vehicle, that its tail was a cluster of US Marines hiding for cover beneath the armour, moving forward together each time their protection revved its engines and manoeuvred closer to the Tigris. There was a burst of gunfire from the Americans, a smart clatter of rocket-propelled grenades and puffs of white smoke from the Iraqi soldiers and militiamen dug into their foxholes and trenches on the same riverbank further south. It was that quick, that simple and awesome. Indeed, the sight was so extraordinary, so unexpected, despite all the Pentagon boasts and Bush promises, that one somehow forgot the precedents that it was setting for the future history of the Middle East. Amid the crack of gunfire, the tracers streaking across the river, and the huge oil fires that the Iraqis lit to give them cover to retreat, one had to look away, to the great river bridges further north, into the pale green waters of that most ancient of rivers, to realize that a Western army on a moral crusade had broken through to the heart of an Arab city for the first time since Maud marched into the same city of Baghdad in 1917, and Allenby into Jerusalem in 1918. But Allenby entered Jerusalem on foot, out of respect for the holy city, and yesterday's American thrust into Baghdad had neither humility nor honour about it. The Marines and Special Forces, who spread out along the west bank of the river, broke into Saddam Hussein's largest palace, filmed its lavatories and bathrooms, and lay resting on its lawns before moving down towards the Rashid Hotel and sniping at both soldiers and civilians. Hundreds of Iraqi men, women and children were brought in agony to Baghdad's hospitals in the hours that followed. Victims of bullets, shrapnel and cluster bombs, we could see the twin-engined American A-10s firing their depleted uranium rounds into the far shore of the river. From the eastern bank, I watched the Marines run towards a ditch with rifles on their shoulders to search for Iraqi troops. But their enemies went on firing from the mudflats to the south until, one after another, I saw them running for their lives. The Iraqis clambered out of their foxholes amid the American shellfire and began an Olympics of terror along the waterside. Most kept their weapons. Some fell back to an exhausted walk. Others splashed right into the waters of the Tigris, up to their knees, even their necks. 3 soldiers climbed from a trench with their hands in the air, in front of a group of Marines. But others fought on. The stomp, stomp, stomp of the American guns went on for more than an hour. Then the A-10s came back, and an F-18 fighter bomber that sent a ripple of fire along the trenches, after which the shooting died away. It seemed as if Baghdad would fall within hours, but the day was to be characterized with that most curious of war's attributes, a crazed mixture of normality, death, and high farce. For even as the Americans were fighting their way north up the river and the F-18s were returning to bombard the bank, Sahaf, the Iraqi Minister of Information, turned up to give a press conference on the roof of the Palestine Hotel, scarcely half a mile from the battle. As the shells exploded to his left and the air was shredded by the power-diving American jets, Mohammed Shahaf announced to perhaps 100 journalists that the whole thing was a propaganda exercise. The Americans were no longer in possession of Baghdad airport. Reporters must check their facts and recheck the facts. That's all I ask you to do. Mercifully, the oil fires, bomb explosions, and cordite smoke now obscured the western bank of the river, so that fact-checking could no longer be accomplished by looking past Shahaf's shoulder. What the world wanted to know, of course, was if Baghdad was about to be occupied, whether the Iraqi government would surrender, and, the mother of all questions, where was Saddam? But Sahaf used his time to condemn Al Jazeera for its bias towards the United States and to excoriate the Americans for using the lounges and halls of Saddam Hussein to make cheap propaganda. The Americans will be buried here, he shouted above the battle. Don't believe these invaders. They will be defeated. Only a week ago, Sahaf had informed us that the Americans would acquire graves in the desert. Now their place of interment had moved to the city. And the more he spoke, the more we wanted to interrupt Sahaf to say, "But hang on, Mr. Minister, take a look over your right shoulder." But of course there was only smoke over his right shoulder. "Why didn't we all take a drive around town?" he suggested. So I did. The corporation's double-decker buses were running, and if the shops were shut, stallholders were open, and near Yasser Arafat Street, men had gathered in cheap tea houses to discuss the war. I went off to buy fruit, and the shopkeeper didn't stop counting my dinars, all 11,500 of them, when a low-flying American jet crossed the street and dropped its payload 1,000 meters away in an explosion that changed the air pressure in our car in our ears. But every street corner had its clutch of militiamen, and when I reached the side of the foreign ministry on the western bank of the river upstream from the Marines, an Iraqi artillery crew was firing a 120mm gun at the Americans from the middle of a dual carriageway, its tongue of fire bright against the grey-black fog that was drifting over Baghdad. Within an hour and a half, the Americans had moved up the southern waterfront and were in danger of overrunning the old Ministry of Information. Outside the Rashid Hotel, they opened fire on civilians and militiamen alike, blasting a passing motorcyclist onto the road and shooting at a Reuters photographer who escaped with only bullet holes in his car. All across Baghdad, hospitals were inundated with wounded, many of them women and children, hit by fragments of cluster bombs. By dusk, the Americans were flying F-18s in close air support to the Marines, so confident of their destruction of Iraq's anti-aircraft gunners that they could clearly be seen cruising the brown and grey skies in pairs over central Baghdad, turning lazily southwards and west while the cross-river shellfire continued. Mid-afternoon, the Americans had located an ammunition dump on the western bank of the river and not far from the presidential palace. One of 3 they occupied, and blew up the lot in a sheet of flame several hundred feet high. For hours afterwards, shells could be heard whizzing from the conflagration, sometimes exploding in the sky, even as they did so. The Americans, clearly intending to enrage Saddam and his ministers, transmitted live pictures of their exploration of the Republican Palace. On the banks of the Tigris, videotape that showed the presidential lavatory seat, Saddam's marble-walled bathroom, and gold-plated taps and chandeliers, and Special Forces soldiers sunbathing, though there was no sun, on the presidential lawn. As night fell, I came across a small rampart of concrete at the eastern end of the Great Rashid Bridge over the Tigris. Its 3 Iraqi defenders had propped their Soviet-made rocket-propelled grenade launchers neatly in line along the top of the parapet. Hundreds of American tanks and armoured vehicles were pouring towards the Tigris from the southwest of Baghdad. And these 3 Iraqis, 2 Ba'athist militiamen and a policeman, were standing there ready to defend the eastern shore from the greatest army ever known to man. That in itself, I thought, said something about both the courage and the hopelessness of the Arabs. The pain was still to come. So I'll leave it there. That's about half the chapter. The chapter 77 pages long. I haven't scanned through the second half of the chapter. I don't know if I'll do a part 2 to this. But for now, that's I'll leave it there.